Welcome, Hub community. I'm Sean Speer, the Hub's editor at large, and I'm grateful to be in conversation today with Joseph Steinberg, University of Toronto economics professor and a leading thinker and scholar on macroeconomics in general and trade in particular. Joseph, we're speaking on July 11th. Last night, of course, we had an open letter from President Donald Trump to Mark Carney threatening the imposition of 35% tariffs on Canadian exports to the United States in this context of on what are to believe to be ongoing negotiations of a new trade and security agreement between the two countries. Let's just start big picture. How should we think about the letter? What sense are you making of it this morning?
So a couple of thoughts. Number one, Canada has not been singled out this week. We're just one of many recipients of these tariff threat letters from the president. Many smaller countries, but also some bigger countries too, like Brazil, for example, received
Yes.
a letter that was even more threatening in some ways just a few days ago. So President Trump is not necessarily, I think, singling Canada out for punishment this week. This was the week that he had earmarked long ago for the kind of deadline of the summer tariff negotiations that he had planned. And so to some degree, this week is just kind of the end result of what has happened in terms of negotiations that have, been happening, or in many cases not happening, over the past couple of months. So
Yes.
we did kind of know something was coming, sometime around this week.
You said there was a couple of things you wanted to say though.
Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to say, that I think everybody out there who is looking at this letter and looking at this as a dramatic escalation in terms of U.S. trade policy towards Canada, and something that is going to have dramatic, effect on our economy going forward. I think it's really important to highlight that although this letter does not explicitly make mention of the exemptions for USMCA products, products that the U.S. imports from Canada that comply with the rules and regulations of the USMCA free trade agreement that was negotiated during President Trump's first term. Everyone I have talked to, including contacts within the Trump administration, off the record, but everybody I have talked to indicates that these USMCA exemptions are going to continue. So this 35% tariff is an increase from 25% that we've already got, but only on the products that don't fall under the auspices of the pre-existing free trade agreement. And so if you look at the data currently, even though we have 25% tariffs, ostensibly, if you look at the data, if you take the total amount of tariff duties paid on U.S. imports from Canada and you divide that by the total amount of U.S. imports from Canada, you get a number in the ballpark of 1 to 2%. That's the effective tariff rate that the U.S. is
Yes.
currently paying on imports from Canada. And that's because the vast majority of U.S. imports from Canada do actually comply with the USMCA. And so I look at this and I see the biggest change that I could possibly foresee going forward is an increase in the effective tariff rate of, a fraction of a percent.
Yeah, that's where I was hoping you would go, and I want to spend some time unpacking your observations there because they're so important for our audience. Let's just start with the notion of compliant and non-compliant goods under the USMCA. I think our audience is becoming increasingly familiar with these ideas because we've heard a lot about them over the past several weeks. But help us understand, why would a good not be subject, Joseph, to the tariff provisions or non-tariff provisions under the free trade agreement?
This is a really fascinating question, and it's something that I'm, just starting to look into in my own research. The basic, I think, tension here is that the USMCA, there's some rules that you have to follow in order to
Yes.
comply with the USMCA, ranging from just simple paperwork for many products to, in the automotive industry in particular, but manufacturing more generally, things that are referred to as rules of origin. So the products that you're selling can't contain more than a certain, fraction of content that originated outside of the North American free trade area. And, complying in a real sense with those rules of origins are costly. You actually have to, buy more expensive products from within the free trade area versus perhaps less expensive inputs that might come from China, for example. But also even just, complying with the paperwork is costly. And prior to these tariff threats that we've been facing over the last couple of months, USMCA compliance in many cases was fairly low. And the simple reason for that is that the tariffs that the United States applied under what's known as the most favored nation system, the tariffs that, the US would apply to imports from just, kind of regular WTO member countries, were really low, in most cases ranging from somewhere between 0 to 4%.
Got it.
Right. And so if you're a Canadian exporter, especially in say the automotive industry or the manufacturing industry, where you've got to do a lot of paperwork, but also incur some real costs to comply with the rules of the USMCA, you look at that 4% at most MFN tariff and you say, you know what? I'm not even going to bother. I'm just going to get hit with that 4% tariff because that's less costly for me than complying with the rules of origin and all the other rules of the USMCA. But now, of course, the outside option is 25% tariffs. We're now moving forward in a couple of weeks, even 35% tariffs. Obviously, the costs of compliance are much lower relative to that outside option. And so what we've already seen over the past couple of months, and what we're going to continue to see, especially if this 35% tariff actually comes into force, is a dramatic increase in the rate of compliance with the rules of the USMCA. And so the vast majority of US imports from Canada are going to comply and therefore be exempt from the tariffs entirely.
Got it. So to use your example, if you're a manufacturer in Canada that's exporting something into the United States, that good, to the extent that it conforms or complies with USMCA rules, it's subject to no tariff. If it doesn't comply, it could be subject to as high as a 35% tariff. Help our audience understand, normally, and in particular, as you say, in recent months, what share of Canadian exports into the U.S., Joseph, are compliant and thus not subject to the 25% and possibly 35% tariffs imposed by the U.S. government?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And I think it's something that everybody who's an economist who looks at this stuff is kind of waiting every month to see, what new
Yes.
data comes out. And so to the best of my knowledge, prior to the beginning of this year, the beginning of Trump's term, something around 65% of US imports from Canada were compliant with the USMCA. So that's 35%, maybe even a little bit higher, products that just didn't comply and were just getting hit with MFN tariffs. Now, unfortunately, with these really fast moving events, the data lag, the tariff announcements. And so we don't yet have direct data on the rate of USMCA compliance, at least that I have available to. And so the best that we can do is to do kind of infer the rate of
Yes.
USMCA compliance based on what I would call the applied tariff. And I referred to that earlier. The applied tariff is just simply, we can see in the monthly data the total, tariff collected by the United States on imports from Canada. And we can also see in the monthly data the total trade volumes that are moving across the border. And if you take that first number and divide it by the second, you get a measure of the average tariff rate that is effectively being applied to imports from Canada. And as I said earlier, that number is currently sitting, based on the latest available data in May, somewhere around just south of 2%. And that's a big spike upwards from a flat zero prior to Trump's term, but it's not that high. And so what we've got to kind of watch for is the evolution of that number. And again, I see that the fact that that number is less than 2% currently tells me that the current rate of USMCA compliance is likely far greater than the pre-existing 65% number.
Yeah.
I foresee this number being in somewhere 80 to 90%.
Yeah, it implies, in other words, that notwithstanding the immediate reaction to President Trump's letter, the 35% tariff will not apply to the vast majority of goods leaving Canada and entering the United States, in part because they were always compliant, or as you say, because Canadian exporters have taken steps to bring them in compliance in order to avoid the American tariffs. I know you're an economist and an empiricist and not a political pundit. But just bear with me. Help us understand the logic of bringing forward this threat of a tariff in the context of ongoing negotiations. How should we make sense of it, Joseph?
Well, I mean, I think it is always tough to try to infer what President Trump and his advisors are thinking, but President Trump especially. I think I look at this and I see a couple of possibilities in terms of what's going on there, in terms of the political economy. Number one, this is a threat that the president is using to try to increase his leverage over the prime minister in order to extract some additional concessions. We saw just recently the very short termination of trade negotiations as a result of the digital services tax about to be coming into force. And then, the prime minister canceling that. That's just kind of an example of one of these concessions that the president has been trying to extract. There's been a lot of talk, of course, about supply management.
Yes.
We know that that's not supposed to be on the table based on the bill that recently passed unanimously.
Yes.
But nevertheless, the president, I think, would like to see supply management on the table and see some concessions in the dairy sector, for example. And so I see this as a way to try to increase leverage and perhaps to try to extract some additional concessions, primarily. The only other thing I can say is that there is part of me that looks at all of this and says that the president just likes tariffs, and he wants to be able to claim victory in terms of imposing, at least on the face of it, some kind of high tariffs on his main trading partners. And again, this USMCA exemption kind of allows him to have, I think, his cake and eat it too, in some sense, that he gets to say, I put these high 35% tariffs on Canada, but in actuality, those tariffs are not biting. But he gets to kind of go out to his supporters and say, look, I did this thing. It makes me look, I'm being tough. I'm, putting tariffs on everybody out there, including Canada.
In the letter, Joseph, the president sets out that one way for Canadian companies to avoid tariffs is to shift production to the United States, where he says, quote, "We will do everything possible to get approvals quickly, professionally, and routinely. In other words, in a matter of weeks." As a matter of theory and your empirical research, can tariffs and have tariffs been used as an inducement to try to pull capital and production out of countries into one's own country to jump over the tariff wall to access the market? And if so, what is the risk for Canada here?
I think empirically there's not much evidence that this kind of thing works. And in part, that's because, the last few decades have been a period of declining tariffs and kind of, big increases in globalization along many dimensions. And so we simply don't have, much data on episodes like this to base our conclusions on. But everything that I've seen indicates that this is not something that is likely to have a material effect on, multinationals that are based outside of the United States shifting production into the United States. And a big reason for that, in my own opinion, in part on my own research, is that these decisions are not made on, in the span of a couple of weeks. These decisions about where to set up a new factory, where to locate, the entire production chain, these are decisions that are made on, a decades-long horizons. These are the planning processes that take a long time, but also the returns to these decisions. The economic returns accrue over many decades even. They don't accrue over the span of a couple of weeks. And so firms are not looking at this and saying, the current tariff rate is, maybe 35%. I'm going to move my stuff across, move my, factory across the border and set up shop and start producing right away to get as you said, get over that tariff wall. What they're looking at in making these decisions is, what are the tariffs going to be next year? What are the tariffs going to be in 5 years? What are they going to be in 10 years or even longer than that? And I don't think there are any manufacturers out there that are looking at this and saying, I'm placing a high probability on the current, slate of tariffs as being something that's going to go forward into the future and over many decades. There's a great deal of uncertainty about what the expected, what the tariffs will look like, even in 2 weeks. let alone 5 or 10 years from now. And so firms are simply not going to react to these kinds of announcements in the way that I think the president is, hoping that they will.
Well, there's certainly a lot of uncertainty, and we're grateful to spend some time with you, Joseph, to parse through the president's letter and understand these issues, drawing on your scholarship and experience. Joseph Steinberg, economics professor at the University of Toronto and a regular Hub contributor. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Good talking with you as always.